The first time Emily Walker stepped into Ridgewood High, whispers trailed behind her like shadows. She walked with her head down, her dark hair cascading over one side of her face, partially obscuring the black eye patch she always wore. In a school where standing out meant social exile, Emily became the target of cruel jokes before she even reached her locker. "Pirate girl!" a voice snickered from behind. A chorus of laughter followed, bouncing off the tiled walls of the crowded hallway. Emily ignored them. She had grown used to the stares, the whispered speculations, the constant judgment. No one knew the truth, and she intended to keep it that way. But high school is a breeding ground for curiosity, and Ridgewood was no different. The rumors started almost immediately. Some claimed she had lost her eye in a freak accident. Others whispered that she had a hideous scar beneath the patch. The most outlandish rumor suggested that she had seen something so horrifying it had burned her eye right out of her skull. She never denied or confirmed any of them. It was safer that way. Lunch period was the worst. The cafeteria, filled with students divided into their usual cliques, always had a few who thrived on making others miserable. That day was no different. "Hey, Emily!" a girl's voice rang out. It was Sarah, the queen bee of Ridgewood High. "What's with the eye patch? You hiding a third eye or something?" Her friends erupted into laughter, nudging each other, waiting for Emily to react. But she didn't. She kept her eyes on her tray, methodically poking at her mashed potatoes. Sarah, unsatisfied with the lack of response, leaned in closer. "Oh, come on. Don't be shy. We all want to know what's under there." "You really don't?" Emily muttered, barely above a whisper. "Try me," Sarah challenged. For the first time, Emily lifted her gaze, locking eyes with the girl. Her visible eye, a deep brown, was unreadable. Some things aren't meant to be seen. The tension around the table thickened. A few of Sarah's friends shifted uncomfortably, but Sarah grinned, sensing an opportunity to entertain the crowd. "That sounds like a challenge. What do you think, guys? Should we take a peek?" The laughter resumed, but now, a few students who had been watching in silence exchanged nervous glances. There was something unsettling about Emily, something that didn't quite fit the usual school drama. That night, Sarah and her friends devised a plan. It was meant to be harmless, just a little fun at Emily's expense. They would sneak into her house, find out what was behind the eye patch, and prove that the whole thing was nothing more than an act. They didn't know what they were walking into. At precisely 2 a.m., Sarah, Jake, and Lisa arrived outside Emily's house. It was an old, creaky structure on the outskirts of town, surrounded by towering oak trees that shuddered in the wind. The place was eerily quiet, with only the faint glow of a street lamp illuminating the overgrown lawn. "Are we really doing this?" Lisa whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Don't tell me you're scared," Sarah scoffed. "It's just Emily. What's the worst that could happen?" Jake, who had been unusually silent, hesitated before muttering, "Let's just get this over with." They crept toward the side of the house, where a window was slightly ajar. One by one, they climbed inside, landing in what appeared to be a small sitting room. It was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of something old and decaying. "This place is weird," Jake murmured. "No kidding," Lisa added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just find her room and get out of here." They moved through the house cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The house was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their weight. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Sarah placed a hand on the doorknob and pushed it open. Emily was sitting on her bed, facing the window, her back to them. The pale moonlight streamed in, casting an eerie glow around her silhouette. She didn't turn when they entered. "Emily?" Sarah called, her voice suddenly unsure. Silence. Then, slowly, Emily turned to face them. "I warned you," she whispered. Before they could react, she reached up and pulled off the eye patch. The room was instantly swallowed by an unnatural darkness, thick and suffocating. A sound, low and guttural, rumbled through the walls, making the very air tremble. The three intruders tried to move, to scream, but their bodies refused to obey. And then, they saw it. It wasn't an empty socket. It wasn't a scar. It was an eye, but not like any human eye. It was impossibly deep, swirling with an abyss of something ancient, something hungry. The moment their gaze locked onto it, they felt their minds unraveling, their thoughts spiraling into madness. The last thing Sarah heard before everything went black was Emily's whisper, filled with something that was almost pity. "I told you not to look." Jake woke up screaming. He was in his bedroom, drenched in sweat, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The room was dark, but not nearly as dark as the void he had seen in Emily's eye. He clutched his head, trying to push away the memories, but they clung to him like a sickness. Something was wrong. Lisa's face flashed in his mind, her wide, unblinking eyes, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Sarah had been right beside him, frozen, her pupils dilated with terror. Then nothing. The darkness swallowed them whole. How had he gotten home? A soft tapping noise pulled him from his thoughts. His bedroom window. A slow, deliberate tap-tap-tap. Dread coiled in his stomach as he turned his head toward the sound. Outside, barely visible against the moonlight, stood a figure. Its outline was distorted, its features shifting like smoke. But the eyes? Jake knew those eyes. They had followed him back. Jake tried to convince himself it was a dream, that the memories weren't real. But the shadows in his room stretched unnaturally, the darkness thickening in the corners like something living. He hadn't seen Lisa or Sarah at school. He hadn't even heard from them. The next night, the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't just his window. It was the walls, the closet door, the floor beneath his bed. Then he heard the whisper, a voice barely audible, but unmistakable. "Jake, we saw it, and now it sees us." His breath hitched. It was Sarah's voice, and she was right outside his door. Jake's heart pounded as he stared at the door. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. He didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. If he stayed still, maybe it would go away. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking was slow, deliberate, each sound vibrating through his chest. His fingers curled into his sheets, his body frozen in terror. "Jake, open the door," Sarah's voice whispered from the other side, but it didn't sound quite right. There was something off about it, like a distorted recording of her voice, played too slow. He squeezed his eyes shut. This isn't real. This isn't real. The doorknob rattled. Jake let out a strangled gasp, scrambling backward in bed. His foot knocked over a glass of water on his nightstand, sending it crashing to the floor. The noise was deafening in the silence. Everything went still. For a moment, Jake hoped it was over. Then, a whisper slithered through the darkness. "We're already inside." Jake's blood turned to ice. A presence loomed behind him. He felt the weight of it before he even turned around. Cold breath tickled the back of his neck, sending shivers down his spine. His body refused to move, his muscles locked in pure, unfiltered terror. Slowly, as if dragged by an unseen force, he turned his head. The darkness in the corner of his room shifted. A shape emerged, tall and twisting, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a gaping void, a swirling black abyss that seemed to pull the very light from the room. Jake tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the suffocating silence. The figure leaned closer. He could feel it, consuming the space around him, devouring the air. The void where its eyes should be locked onto his own. And suddenly, he was falling. When Jake opened his eyes, he wasn't in his room anymore. He was standing in the middle of Ridgewood High. But it wasn't Ridgewood High. Not really. The hallways were wrong, too long, too narrow. The walls pulsed, as if they were alive. Lockers lined the corridor, their metal doors rusted, warped into grotesque shapes. The overhead lights flickered, casting elongated shadows that slithered across the floor. A faint sob echoed down the hallway. Jake turned, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Hello?" No answer. He took a cautious step forward. The floor groaned beneath him. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of something decayed. His breath fogged in the freezing air, each exhale a reminder that he was still here, still trapped. Another sob. This time he recognized it. "Lisa!" he called out, his voice trembling. The sobbing stopped. Silence swallowed the corridor. Then, from the far end of the hallway, a figure emerged. A girl. Her head hung low, her blonde hair tangled and matted. Her arms hung limply at her sides, fingers twitching. "Lisa!" Relief flooded through Jake. "Lisa! We have to get out of here. We!" She lifted her head. Jake's stomach dropped. Lisa's eyes, what was left of them, were nothing but hollow pits, black and endless. Her mouth stretched open, far too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed to extend into infinity. A low, inhuman growl rumbled from her throat. Then she lunged. Jake barely had time to react. He stumbled backward, his body screaming for him to run. But the hallway stretched on forever, twisting and turning in impossible ways. The walls closed in, the shadows writhing like living things. "Jake!" Lisa's voice was a warped, broken echo. "You looked, and now it sees you." A hand, cold and skeletal, clamped around his wrist. Jake screamed. Jake woke with a jolt, gasping for air. His body trembled as he frantically looked around. He was back in his room. Morning light streamed through his window, casting familiar shadows on the walls. It was over. It had to be over. Then he saw the marks on his wrist, deep, bruise-like impressions in the shape of fingers. And he knew. It wasn't a dream. Jake couldn't go back to school. Not yet. Not after what had happened. He tried calling Sarah. No answer. Lisa's phone? Disconnected. He was alone in this. But he needed answers. Emily. She was the only one who could explain what was happening. The only one who could help. He had to find her before it was too late. Jake had no choice. He had to find Emily. She was the only one left who might have answers. The bus ride to her house felt endless. The roads stretched unnaturally long. The houses warped, their windows dark and hollow. The world outside seemed off, as though he were still trapped in that nightmare version of Ridgewood High. When he arrived, Emily's house was eerily quiet. The porch light flickered as he approached the door. He knocked once, then twice. No answer. He turned the knob. Unlocked. The house was dark, save for a dim light spilling from a room at the end of the hallway. The air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. The wooden floor groaned under his weight as he stepped inside. "Emily?" he called. No response. His pulse pounded as he moved closer to the light. The walls were covered in scribbled notes, photos, and torn-out pages from books. Symbols, ancient, unrecognizable, were scrawled in black ink. And in the center of it all, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, her fingers twitching over an old, leather-bound book. "Jake?" she whispered, not looking up. "Emily, what is this? What's happening to me?" She finally raised her head. Her eyes were bloodshot, dark circles beneath them. "You shouldn't have looked. What does that mean? What did I see?" Emily swallowed hard. "It's called the Hollowed One. It feeds on those who acknowledge it. The moment you noticed it, really saw it, it saw you back." Jake's stomach churned. "How do I stop it?" Emily hesitated before sliding the book toward him. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with faded ink. She pointed to an illustration of a grotesque, eyeless figure with elongated limbs. "You have to blind yourself to it. Close your mind. Pretend it isn't real, even though it is. If you give it power, it will consume you." Jake clenched his jaw. "And if I can't?" Emily's hands trembled. "Then it will take you. Completely." A cold whisper slithered through the room. The candlelight flickered violently. Jake turned sharply. The shadows in the corner twisted, forming something tall and impossible. "The Hollowed One. It's here," Emily breathed. "Jake, don't look at it." But it was too late. The entity surged forward. The air grew thick, suffocating. Jake felt his body being pulled toward the void that was its face. His vision blurred. The world distorted. Then, Emily screamed, grabbing his wrist and slamming a vial of something pungent against his forehead. A blinding white light exploded through the room, and Jake collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. When he opened his eyes, the entity was gone. Emily knelt beside him, her breathing ragged. That was our only chance. If it comes back, I don't think I can save you again. Jake stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. The bruises on his wrist still burned. He knew the truth now. Knew that if he let his guard down, if he let it creep back into his thoughts, it would return. And next time there would be no escape. The next morning, Jake returned to school. Everything seemed normal. Students laughed in the hallways. Teachers went about their lessons. But he saw it now. In the corners. In the reflections. In the flickering of the lights. It was watching. Waiting. Jake tightened his grip on his books, forcing himself to walk forward, to act as though he saw nothing. Because if he acknowledged it for even a second, it would see him too.